and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to the Exceptional Conservative Show live from the nation's capital. We certainly are not ashamed of the good news of conservatism, for it is the power of liberation, first to the Republican and then to the tyrant. Um, Ladies and gentlemen, the whole conversation of speaking with Dr. Reisman earlier um, is really unsettling on a number of parts. Um, the whole idea that you have predators of children, individuals who wake up in the early morning with plans on being devious and malicious towards your children, abusing them, making them victims. Sexual addiction is part of that particular process as well. I wanted Jon Uhler to come on the air with us tonight to talk about sexual addiction versus predators. Uh, Not just because of the Hunter Biden situation, the Anthony Weiner situation, and so on, which I believe that all of this is going to blow completely up and people are going to see exactly what's happening in this particular city, Washington, D.C. But you have to understand the culture, the subculture of victimhood, and how individuals are able to survive and overcome. Uh, Jon Uhler has been in this particular industry for a long period of time as a counselor, not just in private business, but as well in the prison system. And he provides a very unique uh, opportunity for us to talk about the mindset of the predator. Without further ado, I want to introduce to some and present to others Jon Uhler. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Jon. You have a very tough role and responsibility in our culture, and that is to provide counsel to those who have the greatest need. I want to question you in this regard. Why Survivor Support Incorporated? Why did you start that organization? What is its purposes, and what successes have you had?
I appreciate it. Can you hear me
You clearly,
first?
yes.
Okay. Um, why survivorsupport.net? Well, it's survivor support, but the site is survivorsupport.net. And the purpose for starting that was really it became the umbrella organization for what was originally, and it still exists, churchprotect.org, which was my vehicle to help churches understand what I never understood, because once upon a time I was heading into vocational ministry.
Mm,
So I'm very, I've got a theological background,
yes.
ironically. I had never been taught, I had never been trained, really in the area of two things. One, about survivors and the trauma that happens as a result of sexual abuse. That was not a part of my training. So
Yes.
that really represents sort of the first third of my professional background was working with survivors. I hadn't a clue. And I don't think the majority of pastors understand what happens in terms of the majority of people that experience sexual abuse and what that means and what that entails. I then started working with kids in the system, and that was a tremendous training opportunity for my work eventually with the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections on the
Yes.
psychology staff. What I found over the course of 11 years, and I was hired to start the nation's first intensive treatment program in long-term solitary confinement. Um,
Wow.
and from there, so I've logged more clinical contact hours than any other psychology staff member, prison psychology staff member in the US because of that. But I did a deep dive. I wanted to know, in terms of dealing with men that have harmed other people, but then also harmed people sexually, because from there I ended up heading up one of the state's high intensity sex offender units for sexually violent predators and high intensity sex offenders. Then was certified in the hair psychopathy checklist, and then was doing low and high intensity sex offender treatment in general population as well. And then did a lot of specialized evaluation of sex offenders as far as psychological evaluations and risk assessments. I did not know the half of what I discovered, and I guess I was a little different than the average psychology staff member in prison. Number one, that was not my planned career trajectory.
Yeah.
So I came in, right? So I came into that experience really a journey in and of itself as far as I wanted to know. Because I was working with the kinds of men that harmed my previous, the kinds of clients I worked with,
Yes.
I wanted to know, how does somebody become that way? And then I quickly realized I had access, the kind of access that an outside researcher would give their eye teeth for. I also realized something else, that those that had the same kind of access within the prison system, for whatever strange reason, didn't really care to know all that much. They went in and they do their job. I think in a way, sadly, in a perfunctory way. So I guess I was an anomaly, and only the Lord could do that. And so
Yes.
I had the kind of access that a researcher would dream of. And then I had the intensity of someone that wanted to know. So every day I did a deep dive. And what I discovered was also not written in a lot of the literature. So there's a lot of misnomers. But I started churchprotect.org after retiring from, or really the last year while I was on psych staff, to train churches to help them understand that the vast majority of the predators that are going to target churches are not the ones they are preparing for. The snatch and grab, the yank and grab kind of predator is 1% to 3%, or just a very, very small percentage. And the worst of the worst of predators specifically target churches.
Really?
Absolutely. And I didn't know that. It's not in the literature. At some point in time, I'll publish. I just haven't had the time yet.
Yes.
But I've put together trainings for churches. But then I also wanted the focus at the end of my trainings. I wanted the focus not just to be on shining the light on cockroaches, but in helping churches understand that approximately 40% of every congregation has been sexually violated in some capacity in their lives. Yet the vast majority of pastors can only name maybe one or two, if that, people in their congregation that have been sexually violated. And sadly, the effects of that prevent someone who's a survivor from being able to meaningfully attend to sermons, and being able to, it prevents them also from meaningfully connecting with people, and also having devotions or quiet time. And there's a whole lot of issues. And so I was unaware of that as well. So that's really why I started survivorsupport.net. So that became the umbrella organization of churchprotect.org. So both sites are up and running.
Doctor, and ask here, let me be the naive, innocent individual and thinking that there is a certain type, the guy with the trench coat on, the creepy, sleazy kind of guy that you can just identify. Is there a certain type of person that characterizes a sexual predator?
Yes, and it really comes down, there's about 8 categories.
Wow.
During my time. Yeah. Now, nobody's written about it. I at some point in time, I have posted my material, a lot of my material from my trainings as far as charts. It can be found on churchprotect.org. And at some point during my trainings, I go into this. But the majority of sex offenders, especially the ones that are going to target churches, are what I call, and this is my area of focus, the greatest concern, is what I call the sophisticated sexual predator, especially the sophisticated child predator. And the working definition of that, my working definition, is one that has many, many victims, yet no one suspected. And by the time he was finally busted, you can also have females, but there's very few of those.
Yeah.
By the time he's busted, everybody around him is surprised. And the question is, why are they surprised? Because he was that good. He's that sophisticated. And so we all think in terms of, the guy in the park, stranger danger, and I'm not
Yeah.
minimizing any of that. But again, that's a very small fraction, and we should be mindful of that. We should teach our kids exactly what we're teaching them. But think in terms of the predators that make the news. By the time they're busted, these guys have many victims, and they've been perpetrating for years. And they turn out to be elders and deacons and pastors, and we're all shocked. And so the question is, how many victims does a snatch and grab perpetrator have? And again, I'm not minimizing that.
Yeah.
But by the time he's busted, he'll probably have 8 to 10, 15, 20. I'm not minimizing any of that.
Yeah.
But he may have about 20, right? Because he's going to get busted at some point in time. Those are the ones that the warnings go out.
Mm-hmm.
Be on the lookout for that certain Mustang. So he's eventually going to get busted. It's the sophisticated one that looks so normal. Psychology's come along late in the game because the book of Romans references what's called a reprobate mind.
Yes.
If you look at Romans chapter 1, it gives the stair-step process downward. And, it references homosexuality, of course, but the question is, just because it doesn't reference child predation, someone that harms a child, the question is this: does that exist? Did it exist at the time? And why didn't Paul reference it? I would simply say this: the vast majority of cultures around the world frown on somebody harming a child.
Yes.
So it was understood in Paul's mind that no one's going to harm a child because the law would take care of that. Think in terms of Jesus sort of out of the blue, it looks like, spoke to those in the church. I mean, as bad as an individual is in 2 Peter chapter 2, he's talking about somebody that focuses on adults. Peter is.
Yes.
So that's a manipulative adult going after other adults in the church. He doesn't even focus on a child. Why? Because the understood expectation was if somebody harms a child, the law is going to take care of that. But because our theology has become so warped,
Yes.
predators know it. Predators have such an easy time in churches because the vast majority of churches and the vast majority of pastors cannot meaningfully differentiate the difference between a prodigal and a predator.
Yes.
And they don't know. They may be able to put it on paper that Romans chapter 1 is inspired, but when you begin to ask someone, can someone fall beyond the point of being able to be redeemed? Is there a point of no return? That's when Christians start to become uncomfortable because they don't know what a reprobate mind means. A reprobate mind in the modern vernacular, psychological vernacular, is a psychopath. And so there are two different types of psychopaths. There's a bloody psychopath and a white-collar psychopath. That comes from Dr. Robert Hare, who's the godfather of psychopathy, so to speak, the creator of the Hare psychopathy checklist. I'm certified in that.
Yes.
And Bill Clinton, for instance, Dr. Hare uses Bill Clinton as that example, as well as Bernie Madoff, who made off with everybody's money on the NASDAQ.
Sure.
So once somebody crosses a certain point, and there's a morphing process, And that's what most people don't understand. I didn't, because I had come to believe what was in all the textbooks in my grad school textbook about people that harm children. And Judith Reisman, I heard her. Judith is a wonderful person. I've gotten to know her recently.
Yes.
And I listened to her response, and her response is pretty close, but it's not quite. And that doesn't fault Judith. I mean, you want somebody that's an expert on Kinsey. She's nailed it.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting, and it's hard to grasp. But once you see it, you begin to understand that a child predator does not harm a child out of what we consider to be lust.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first thing to understand. And I use the term, I haven't come up with a better term, normal lust. There's nothing normal about lust. But right, but I mean, think
Yeah.
about what we all normal people, normal guys wrestle with.
Yeah.
That's, if you look upon a woman to lust after her.
Yeah.
A child predator doesn't go after a child because of lust, because there is nothing attractive about a child's body.
Yes.
Okay. It's not about lust, it's about deviance and beyond. Deviance, one way to view it is deviance is a desire or enjoying harming someone else. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people think that's power and control.
Yes.
For a child predator, it's even worse. There is a morphing process, there's a stair step process downward. It always starts with adult porn. It eventually transitions down to what the inmates would call, and I didn't know this at the time, what they call barely legal. There's actually a magazine by that was started by a woman. 50 Shades of Grey was produced by a woman or written by a woman. And then Barely Legal magazine, she sold it to Hustler.
Mm-hmm.
But as someone begins the process of getting further and further into lust, it'll transition into deviance. And the essence of that is I'm no longer excited necessarily by the person's body.
Yes.
I'm excited by the impact I'm having on that person.
Wow.
And the impact is harm. I'm harming them. And eventually, as the morphing process takes place, and that all happens at the same time that somebody's conscience, it all comes down to conscience, that conscience is being violated. That's why the working definition of a psychopath is simply this: someone that has violated their conscience to such an extent that there's no longer any remorse and there's no longer any empathy, meaning I don't feel for that person, I don't feel badly. You can get to a point where you have so violated your conscience that you no longer feel badly that you have violated it, but you get to a point that you are relieved not to have one.
Mm.
I used to believe, as a number of theologians believe, that hell will be filled with people whose consciences have come back alive and now it plagues them, and hence wailing and gnashing of teeth.
Teeth. Yeah.
I don't believe that to be the case. I think what happens is this, because I've seen it in long-term solitary. A psychopath is someone that has to have the last word, last say, and last laugh. You deny that to a psychopath, and there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth.
Wow.
To tell a psychopath that they lost, game over, that's what causes a psychopath or a reprobate individual to wail and gnash their teeth. There's no longer remorse because they love what they do. And isn't that biblical? Right? They get up, everything about them is driven now. And for a child predator, and once they reach that barely legal stage, it's very interesting. And it was very interesting to watch because within the sex offender groups, they were not, the groups were not constructed based upon the individual's offense.
Mm-hmm.
as far as the guys. We would have 12 to 15 guys for starting. You don't have a group, at least in Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. My guess is it's the same across the nation, but you have them based upon what's called risk level. So that means within a group of, let's say, 15 men,
Yes.
2/3 are going to have adult victims. About a third are going to have child victims,
Mm.
which means you put them all together. And one thing became very clear, and it shocked me because I would have thought, you know what? You all harmed somebody sexually, and therefore you're not going to have any pride and you're not going to judge each other. Au contraire. The men that have adult victims want to kill or beat the tar out of those that have child victims, even among sex offenders. Certainly that's true among prison populations. So that was the first thing. And you wouldn't get that from being an outside researcher. That takes a lot of time being around those guys. So an
Exactly.
outside researcher who works in academia that may have a few hours with these guys in a structured setting under supervision of corrections officers, and they know they're being taped, they're never going to get the truth out of those guys. So it
Mm-hmm.
really does take someone, and I would not have believed that until working in a prison system. It takes hours and hours and really months and years to be able to get to a point where, though you're still there in the group, to be able to work it to a point where the guys begin to forget about you. That's the
Yeah.
only way the truth is going to come out. Because everything about a sex offender, but especially a child predator, is, as far as what comes out of his mouth, is going to be in his own best interest.
Exactly.
And that's the difference between sex addiction, by the way, and those that have actually perpetrated upon someone. Those that have perpetrated, they've lost the shame. I know Judith mentioned shame and guilt.
Yes.
That's sex addiction. For those that have gone further and then ended up harming kids, there's actually no shame and there's no guilt. So it's very different
Yes.
by nature.
Doctor, there are a lot of single parents in our society. At one point in the 1960s, 73% of African American families or more had two parents in the household, male and female. Today, that number bridges 80% single mother. There is the single mother who brings home a gentleman, and his interest is not really her, his interest is the child. But the single mother believes that the child has done something to induce the attraction of that man, and thus will leave that child without protection. Have you seen that? And if so, is it the child's fault for attracting the older man?
You described it, you set that scenario up. That is so classic. Um, Number one, that happens all the time, or far too often that happens. Parents, or if I'm speaking to that mother, I want to say two things. One is you have to risk believing that there are men out there that have so morphed in terms of their internal world because of the amount of porn they've consumed. Now, a lot of people ask, well, what about days prior to porn? The process downward in terms of deviance has always been there. But
Mm-hmm.
once pornography was introduced and then the internet, you cannot tell me that in the year 2020, that any guy that's perpetrating upon someone is not into pornography. The vast majority of men are into pornography. And I will tell you this because this was part of my research. 100% of every sex offense, so 100% of sex offenders, are deeply steeped in porn, progressively so. prior to offending, and 100% of child offenders, when they're busted with child porn, which also includes, and I would not have known this, which virtually always includes bestiality, because they move through bestiality first prior to children. When they reach that point, and it all converges, and this was the same for those that had adult victims and those that had child victims, the pathway that porn will take a man is towards younger ages. You look at, if you look at, I don't look at much,
Yeah.
fortunately, but I have, you know. But eventually what happens is the object of pornography starts to look younger and younger. So you have adult women that are dressing up as kids or young teens. And then you look at what's on the media, including cuties, where they try to make kids look like teens. And so it converges, there's a convergence right at puberty. For those that harm adults, the question is this: why didn't they keep going down in terms of age?
Yeah.
Because they had a conscience and they back away. They get shocked. It's interesting. Without exception, I would have these men describe, because I started to focus on this because of Judith's work, because of what I knew. Also because of Ted Bundy's interview with James Dobson a number of years,
Yeah.
3 decades ago. Okay. I knew there was the connection between porn, so I did a deep dive into, with the guys, having them describe and chronicle the progression. And once they knew I was going there, they finally would confess, so to speak. They would talk about it. It always takes them down to that point of demarcation. But those with just adult victims, once they got to barely legal, it was interesting. They all shocked themselves and they backed away. Those with child victims progressed. And as they progressed, they did so eagerly. And so what the single mother needs to know is there are men that have so morphed into predators that they're looking at you, but they're not into you. They're wolves that are into children. And the thing that motivates a predator is the thrill of defiling. And isn't it interesting, biblically, it says the thief comes to steal and destroy. This is even further down. And I'll show you how shocking it is in terms of internally and from the Lord's perspective. Because what did Jesus say that a guy should do? So it's interesting, he doesn't fault a guy necessarily to be attracted to a kid, but it actually, you have to work at being attracted to a child. The whole issue of being born that way, or minor attracted persons, or virtuous pedophiles, all that stuff, those are lies. When a man harms a child, he has worked his way from adult attraction down to children. And the pedophiles knew that as they were being interviewed, the researchers are taking them at face value. But the question is, how reliable are those men? Well, those are the world's greatest liars, or they would have been busted a long time ago. So they are the greatest manipulators. That's very different than child-on-child offense. You look at that kind of situation, and they struggle all through middle school or junior high into high school. As I tell people, if you're going to study sexual predators, which is different than the low-level sex offenders, everything from the simple and idiotic guys that should have been moving on to college girls and they still were hanging around with high school girls, or the manipulators, right? But when it comes to harming children, people need to understand that the morphing process that has taken place is so profound that think about Judas. Now, Judas, he's very unique among human beings.
Yes.
There were many people that have been demon possessed, but how many people can we point to in Scripture that were ever Satan possessed? And the Scripture says he went to his own place. Now the question is this: do you think Judas would have ever harmed a child? I don't think so. So the question is, how bad do you have to be if you're worse than Judas? So no wonder
Wow.
Jesus said, if you're going to harm a child, you better do something very radical to yourself. A really heavy rock and a really deep ocean. Well, you can you
Tie
can
it.
you can drown yourself in a puddle. So why did he use that type of terminology? Because I'm convinced of this. Because the impact and effect that sexual perpetration has on the person, the victim, the survivor, is so profound and it's so deep. And it's not only just emotional, not only just psychological and social, but it is spiritual. That Jesus, I believe, is saying this: if you're going to hang something around the neck of anyone that will cause them to be scandalon, stumble over this millstone, you perpetrated against a child, and the one thing they will stumble over the rest of their life is wondering about the nature of God and his care and concern.
Mm-hmm.
I'm convinced that the vast majority of lesbians have been perpetrated upon by somebody connected to a church. That's why
Wow.
they're so angry. I've never met a radical feminist who is not also radically angry at God and has dismissed God. Why? Because a man connected to, I've just heard it too many times.
Yes.
Hence, they stumble over that. And so I'm convinced Jesus is saying, instead of, you better go stumble over it yourself. You better put that thing around your own neck rather than saddling a child with that for the rest of their life where they will stumble over it. So, what a single mother, sorry, to segue back, what a single mother needs to understand is this: there are men that are predators who are no longer normal, but really look normal, because the more psychopathic somebody becomes, and you can do a Google search for images of psychopaths' brains or the brains of psychopaths. And now science has revealed what the Bible described, but it's sort of interesting in seeing the proof that a psychopath's brain is 100% different in terms of empathy and in terms of motivation.
Wow.
And the individual that wants a child will do whatever it takes, and they know. And they have no problem screwing around with an adult,
Mm-hmm.
but they're after the child. So these guys will come along and they're sweet talking guys, but they're after children. And so the first thing I would say to a single mother is never have the man stay the night. You need to have boundaries, and you didn't need to do it the old fashioned way, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
You need to find out what's motivating this guy. What's this guy into? And remember, they know that churches are the easiest hunting grounds. And they know how to talk the talk. Judas knew how to talk the talk. Read 2 Peter chapter 2. These guys know how to talk it. You need to go very slowly with this guy, stay out of bed with him, and you're going to find out a lot
Yeah.
about him.
Doctor.
And then these are not wounded individuals. Okay, the difference between a sex addict versus a predator is a predator was not wounded. Bill Clinton was not wounded.
Thank you.
Hunter Biden was not wounded. How do we know? Because you would see a pattern in his life. When you look at the pictures of Hunter Biden getting off Air Force Two with Joe, does he look really wigged out and whacked out? No, crack pipe, we see that. But he can conduct himself in a very smooth and appropriate fashion. Yet, meanwhile, behind the scenes. So, someone that has been wounded sexually, you can tell because you can tell they struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Survivors, by the way, become protective, never predatorial. That's the difference. So what I tell people to do the best research and most accurate research on the difference between a survivor and a sexual predator. To research sexual predators, you're not going to go on the sex offender unit.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to go on the drug and alcohol unit
Really?
in terms of survivors. I'm sorry. So let me repeat that. To find out about the survivors that have been sexually abused, you're not going to go on the sex offender unit. So I reversed it. Sorry about that.
No.
If you want to find out about men that have perpetrated, and there are, but they won't be sophisticated and they won't be after children, you're going to go on to the drug and alcohol unit to do your research. Why? Because they're medicating the pain. Those will be the men that want to harm the child predators. Why? Because they know what it felt like. So I had men in my sex offender groups that had teenage um, victims or adult victims, but never below the age of puberty
Mm-hmm.
because they have a conscience as far as when it comes to kids, they're protective. But generally speaking, they really you won't see them going below the age of 15 or 16. You're just not going to have that because their empathy is still there.
Mm-hmm. Doctor, there are parents watching tonight, and first question is a B, but the A part of that question is, can sex offense be modeled to a younger male or even female? And then, secondly, how can I identify if my child has been abused?
Yeah. Excellent questions. The first is, can it be modeled? I call it scripting. As a matter
Yes.
of fact, I did a video on that, how young kids are set up to offend, primarily boys, quite frankly. It's happening all the time. If you introduce images to a kid, and look what's happening in our world, if you have a child that has a cell phone, which has access to the internet, they're finding porn.
Mm.
The stats vary, but by the time a child is 11, I think 75% of them, I forget the stats, they change all the time
Yeah.
because it's hard to do that kind of social research. But a massive number of kids are seeing images. And where, like Ted Bundy, now, it didn't mean that Ted Bundy didn't have issues, but
Yeah.
I'm firmly convinced what Ted Bundy said is 100% correct because I have interviewed up close and personal for hours and hours and hours serial rapists and murderers that are in long-term solitary. So Dr. Dobson had a couple hours with Ted Bundy. I had months, and I took that seriously. I knew
Mm-hmm.
the Lord had given me that. And so the one direction I headed with these guys was to find out their use of porn, and 100%. And it started early. So where Ted Bundy found a magazine and it started Ted Bundy down that path, look at what's happening with our kids. Look at what's happening with cable TV.
Yes.
Uh, 50
Adult
Shades of
Swim.
Grey,
Adult
right?
Swim.
So I would say, as a parent, you have to assume your child has been exposed to a whole lot of stuff. And if you aren't mindful, that child is just going to continue to go deeper and deeper and deeper. Um, so that's how a child becomes scripted these days is the internet and the programs. And now in schools, unfortunately, and my concern about Biden and Harris with the trans activist agenda is up in Canada, they call it SOGI sex ed, sexual orientation and gender identity sex ed, but it's here as well. Ohio, every state is having to combat it, or it's in schools where they introduce kids to porn. They introduced bondage stuff, 50 Shades of Grey stuff to very young kids. Joe Biden has said he will push for first graders to be able to have sex changes or starting the
Yes.
process of cross-sex hormones. Well, what I have said about the trans movement is this. You remove pornography from the trans movement, and the trans movement will evaporate back to where it came from prior to the year 2005. So these kids are being saturated with porn, and they begin, and their brain, it changes the brain. So you're actually creating an addiction within these kids, and then sending them, a lot of them, down the path of being little predators. So that's the first thing. And my apologies. Remind me of the second question, Ken. I'm sorry about that.
How do you know your child has been abused?
You'll see behavioral changes. Number one,
Yeah.
um, so if they've been abused, and the vast majority of kids, you'll see a difference in boys and girls. So their behavior will start to go to one of two extremes.
Yes.
Okay, the child will either become more agitated, more aggressive, more anxious, and anxiety typically is really the result of adrenaline. So their little system now, because the fight-flight syndrome going on within them, it will force them to be really active, and hence sometimes they're viewed as hyperactive. So they'll either become much more active and aggressive and agitated, and hard to they can't focus because
Yes.
they're sitting on a mountain of stuff, or they become the opposite, which is withdrawn and depressed. You will see a behavioral change within your child. So be very mindful of that. And then the acting out. Now, again, that's different than the adult, that's the sophisticated predator. Because that child, when a child's been perped on, and if that child then perps on, oftentimes it doesn't have to be just boys. A lot of the boys, though, will become aggressive.
Yeah.
Um, they'll be able to see behavioral changes in that child all the way through middle school, junior high, and then high school. The sophisticated predator has no documented evidence that they were troubled kids. But so a parent needs to watch for behavioral changes, mood changes, something's going on. So you have to be involved in the life of your child. Know who is involved in your life and your child's life, and just assume that your child is probably being groomed at school these days in this sense, especially with sex ed. You ask the teacher, ask the school, by the way, to show you the curriculum. There's
Yes.
a number of school districts out there that are actively hiding material from parents. You need to be involved um, intimately in the life of your child, especially in schools these days. I'm very concerned and very fearful that kids are being groomed. If your child comes home referencing about being non-binary, your child's being groomed,
Wow.
100% in one way or another. Okay, because that already means the child is thinking sexual thoughts. Prior to puberty, if left alone, a child will never have a sexual thought. That's why Kinsey was so deviant. It's a
Hmm.
flat out lie that kids are sexual. They're not sexual at birth. Okay, a child won't think in terms of gender. They want just think of normal kids. They play with both boys and girls until they start to get about, puberty, and then they go through that awkward stage.
Yes.
Um, so if a child is thinking about sexual things or about gender, somebody has implanted that, and that usually comes from a number of places, including the internet. Get them off of the various websites and um, Reddit and some of these spaces. They are grooming kids. It's like a cult. The best way to understand the trans movement, by the way, is understand NXIVM, the sex cult, and understand Scientology. They are using sophisticated manipulation to groom kids.
Doctor, in finality, and I thank God for you staying on with me with these questions because we will make certain that this is available on YouTube and as well BitChute and recordings. Um, it's about to blow up here in Washington, D.C. The Hunter Biden sleeping with his 14-year-old niece is opening the Pandora's box of the establishment, the ruling group that has turned its eyes away for the satisfaction of a bribe or promotion or thing of that particular nature, not focused on the child themselves. What do you say to that person who has been sophisticated, has gotten away with it for so long? What should they do right now in Washington, D.C.?
As far as speaking to the perpetrators,
Yes.
the perpetrators are probably beyond the point of no return, and therefore they're intellectually listening to this. I would say they better hope I don't get asked to do their psych evals. But if there's any pangs of guilt whatsoever, you better humble yourself, fall on your face before God, and come clean. But if someone's done that, they have no guilt, and therefore they're psychopathic. Psychopathy is a process. And the less guilt you have, it means you've overridden your conscience and you can get to a point. So this is what I would say. If this barely bothers you any longer, once upon a time it would have. And the question is, how did you get to a point that it doesn't bother you anymore? And if you were listening to this and it barely bothers you, you better be really concerned, because given enough time, this will just be water off a duck's back. And there's no hope for you, because you will think the words out of my mouth are the dumbest thing you've ever heard.
Well, Dr. Uhler, thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to talk with you about coming next week to our town hall and talking on this particular issue. These are issues that adults talk about in secret that they should no longer hide. You got to talk about these particular issues. Dr. Uhler, thank you so much for being on the air with us tonight. How can people get in contact with you if they're listening tonight and say, maybe I'm not ready to come clean, but I need someone to clean me up?
And thank you. And Ken, thank you also for the promotion. I'm not a doctor. I have a master's degree, but I appreciate that very much. They can contact me through survivorsupport.net, also churchprotect.org. But survivorsupport.net is probably the easiest way to contact me. There's also a blog I have. They can't contact me there, but that's survivorsupport.us is my blog. But survivorsupport.net. And if anybody wants to donate, that would be wonderful too. We have all sorts of things we'd love to do if we had the finances.
And you would,
but so could everybody.
You would be open to some single mothers making a few phone calls to you over the next few days. There you go. Single moms,
there you go.
Stop playing the game. Your children's lives are at risk. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, we've gone over time, but it was very valuable, very important. Come back Friday night, 7 p.m., October 30th, before you take your kids trick-or-treating and all that stuff. Let's talk about some real stuff. Town Hall on the media sexualization and abuse of children, featuring Dr. Judith Reisman, and I hope I can get John to come back for that, but you really need to make
I'd be happy to do that.
There you go.
I'd be awesome.
Happy. John will be with us next week. There's a town hall. Stop playing games with your children's lives. Come back. Let's talk about the stuff that needs to be done. For all of you who are tuned in tonight, God bless you and thank you so much. I hope that you got something out of it. If nothing at all, I hope that you do get this. If you don't get anything else, that God bless America. It is now time for America to bless God. Good night. God bless each and every one of you. Mary Brockman, Switchers Gracias. Thank you so much for holding down the fort. And always remember, kiss your kids. Love your children. Because tomorrow's not promised. Good night and God bless each and every one of you.
This is an original instrumental.